What I'd like to talk about today is a personal philosophy and reasoning behind why I chose as a career profession the field of education, and specifically why I chose to teach English literature. So, a broad outline of what I want to talk about is there is something contained within the field of literature that can never be replaced by any significant technological advance. No matter how advanced society becomes, we still will never be able to replace the human element, unless, of course, human beings actually don't exist anymore, in which case the human element will be irrelevant. But as long as there are human beings present on the planet, then the nature of the human being, who is the human being, and what the human being is supposed to be doing or should be doing will always be a relevant question. And this is a question of value. It's a question of morality, in the sense of moral decisions are a way of saying this is the thing that I should do. And it's a question of how do we go about solving the major problems of our society. Even if we have all of the objective knowledge at our fingertips, everything that you could know from a scientific, rational standpoint about the world is available to you, you still will be unable to conclusively say what it is that we should do. What should we do as individuals? What should we do as families, small communities, global communities? How should we act towards each other? How should we behave? What are the solutions to the most critical problems of the current time period? You'll have to have human people in order to solve human problems. And this comes from a sort of reaction to this idea that extensive education in science, technology, and mathematics will somehow naturally lead to a brighter future. Now, I definitely agree that we need as much education in those fields as possible, but there are limitations to them, and we have to make sure that we include a deep understanding, a deep education in the literature tradition of the world, a global literature tradition, because it reaches deep into the nature of the human being, and it reaches into the entire past of how human societies have tried to solve the contemporary problems that they've been confronted with, and contains within it a collected wisdom of who the human being is, how the human being should probably act, and the consequences of choosing to and to not to act in a particular way. Consider the following, that in a not too distant future, a majority of our entire workload will be shouldered by machines and computers. If we are educating students, young people, only to carry on the burden of work, just work itself, we will have, in a sense, failed them once the necessity of working in that sense, in the machine sense, no longer becomes necessary. At our fingertips will be any kind of factual knowledge that we could need, any personal desire, entertainment, sensual pleasure will be only a single search away. The question then becomes, what is then the role of the human being and the work that they must do? If there's no material productive work that needs to be done, no new knowledge has to be discovered in the sense of understanding the objective facts about the world, everything that we could ever want to produce is being produced by machines, and the material necessities of society have essentially been covered. What then will be the place and workload of the human being? I don't take the stance that we will just magically have this utopian society simply because we have eliminated material disparity. Because even though we have the knowledge and we have the materials, we still have to ask the question of, what do human beings do with this? You see, human society will always be confronted with human problems, because we'll never be able to construct anything which, with the flip of a switch, will solve the essential problem of human nature. You see, human nature has within it some deep issues. We have this problem where we just can't seem to get along with one another. And if we think that building a complex machine that can provide all of our material needs will actually solve that problem, we're deluding ourselves. Perhaps even if we should solve the code of who the human being is in terms of their actions and their behaviors. Let's say our knowledge included our ability to edit and change at the genetic level or the cellular level or whatever level was necessary in order to perfectly manipulate how the human being is going to act and behave. They're still left with the moral question of, what should we do? Should we even do that? And if we do, what is the best way to go about accomplishing this task? We must admit first that we don't actually know, that we can't know initially, and then acknowledge that we also won't be the ones around in order to solve these problems. It is our children, and their children who will be around, who will be confronted with some of the most difficult moral problems of any human society, and we have to be able to prepare them to make these decisions. In order to do this, in order to prepare them appropriately, we have to develop and educate a deep thinking ability, the ability to reason morally, to grasp what is important, the problem of value, to grasp what kinds of behaviors are virtuous, what behaviors lead to good outcomes for the individual, for the community, for the global society. How do we even know what good outcomes are? How do we decide that? We have to understand the human being, what is beneficial to them and to the planet as a whole. So we have to teach the kinds of thinking and reasoning that help us understand the nature of the human being, the nature of the human psychology, and what leads the human being to be both a beneficial force and a destructive force in the world. This is the wisdom that is contained in literature and why we must continue to teach it. And we have to teach it in a very specific way. Literature contains the collected wisdom of human experience. What have human beings already tried in society? How have particular human beings acted? What were the consequences of those formations of society? What were the consequences of those actions? What ended up being good, beneficial, and what ended up being destructive? Why was it beneficial? Why was it destructive? How do those same patterns of behavior and psychology apply to the contemporary problems that our society is faced with today? These are deep thinking questions that don't have answers. And they might never have conclusive, perfect answers, but we have to prepare the next generation and the next generation and the generation after that in order to have the cognitive abilities to deal with these problems. We have the answers that have already been tried, but we don't have the right answers for the future. But the better that we can understand those answers that we have already been tried, the better that we can think through new problems and say, how does this apply to what has already happened? How is this new? What connections can I make in order to solve the problems that have been confronting our society? And it's not an individual task as well. We have to teach the ability for people to be in dialogue with each other, where ideas can be shared and refined against each other, a kind of intellectual forge where ideas are clashed against one another and the sort of chaff that is contained within them is worn away and only the best parts of both ideas remain. It's why we have to read the kinds of texts like 1984 to understand the dangers of authoritarianism. Why we have to continue to read Shakespeare like King Lear to understand perspectives on moral virtue. What are the consequences of immoral behavior? How does it totally result in destruction around the immoral person for somebody who simply doesn't care about other people? We read a book like Things Fall Apart so that we understand the struggle and the danger of a life lived solely in the pursuit of power. The problem is that we're not teaching people, young people, how to think. We're only teaching them how to find knowledge and regurgitate it. But by discussing these values as they're portrayed in literature, by looking at issues of moral necessity, we can teach future generations how to appropriately think about the issues that will confront them. The hard problems that human societies will face in the future will not be easily solved, and they will never be perfectly solved. They must be hammered out in the form of public debate, drawing from the great wellspring of the course of human experience, all of the collected wisdom of the lived human experience must be distilled and understood and thought about and then re-articulated in a new form in order for future human societies to solve the major problems of their time. And this requires an intense amount of intellectual rigor, of fortitude and constitution relevant to the immensity of the challenge. Only through educating our students to think, articulate, and debate with a deep understanding of the problems, a deep understanding of what solutions have and haven't been tried, the successes and the failures, and a willingness to accept new ideas with sufficient evidence. All of this is required if they ever have a hope of surviving the great challenges that they will be confronted with in the future. We would be committing a monstrous atrocity to fail to teach our youth how to think, how to reason about morality, how to discuss the major issues of our time and their time, and the gravest of consequences will result from our inability to pass on this skill. We've seen this throughout the course of history, that it seems that the human advance in technology brings us to the brink of global annihilation, only to be saved in the final moment by some sober sense of rationality. And that there is an irreversible cost of letting the pursuit of power, the pursuit of technological gain, outpace the pursuit of the greatest moral good, whatever that may happen to be. Our sense of moral integrity, of commitment to ourselves, the other humans on our planet, and the planet as a whole must stay in pace with our development in technology. Therefore, there is a desperate need to educate young minds in the task of reason analysis, for them to understand the plight of the human being who contains within themselves the capacity for both incredible good and devastating evil, and wrestle with this problem and the solution to how to actually build a society that contains humans who are so divided within themselves. It is not knowledge that our children require, it is the capacity for it. We cannot teach them what to think, but we can teach them how to learn how to think. Above all, We must help them learn how to value the world in which they live, so that they are driven by some moral purpose of making the world a better place for themselves, for the future generations that will come after them. The only other option is total annihilation,